Welcome to Sentence Fragments, a PowerPoint lecture presented by Margaret students in Developmental English at Haywood Community College. What in the world are sentence fragments? A sentence fragment is something that someone has identified as a sentence. It appears to be a sentence, but it does not make a complete thought. Anytime you think of fragments, you think of pieces of something, and that's exactly what a sentence fragment is. It's a part of a sentence, but not a whole sentence. For a group of words, that's a key element of a sentence. For a group of words to be a sentence, all of the following conditions must be in place. It has to contain a subject and a verb. That means a subject and a predicate. Key signal, it has to begin with a capital letter. Another key signal, that group of words ends in closing punctuation. I'll repeat this over and over again through this lecture. And finally, and most important, it has to make a complete thought. So how do fragments happen? Ideally, none of us would like to have fragments in our writing. And now we know what makes a sentence. So how do we confuse a group of words that is not a sentence as a sentence? Well, that group of words probably has had two of the key signals that I listed in the previous slide, beginning with a capital letter and ending in closing punctuation, like a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. However, these are not sentences if they don't make complete thoughts. Without making a complete thought, a group of words can never, ever be a sentence. Yes, students, we are fragment victims. We're victims of our society and how information is provided to us on the television, on radio, in billboards, whatever advertising you may see, and even in our own texting and email. All fragments are not horrible, however. Sometimes fragments are acceptable. They have to be acceptable in advertisements because advertisements by nature are very brief or are contained in very small areas of space. So sound bites or visual bites are very important in order to convey a lot of information in a little bit of space. But in most writing, fragments are not acceptable. That means in your writing for education, in writing for business, and for journalistic writing, fragments are not acceptable. So that we might more easily identify fragments, many authors and textbook writers and grammarians have created categories of fragments. Some of the most common are listed here on this page. Dependent word fragments, phrase fragments, added detail fragments, and missing subject fragments. We're going to start by looking at dependent word fragments. These types of fragments occur when subordinate or dependent clauses have been capitalized and punctuated as sentences. As you should remember from the previous lecture, subordinate clauses are groups of words that contain subjects and verbs, but they don't make complete thoughts. Why? It's because they always begin with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun that links these clauses to main clauses, clauses that could and do make complete thoughts. And these words, subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns, we can link those together as dependent words. Here is a list of subordinating conjunctions. We had this list in the parts of speech lecture, but look at how many we have, and I want you to look at the kinds of meaning that these words imply: after and how, because, so that. The meanings of these words tell us why subordinate clauses don't make complete thoughts. These words right here that connect also leave us hanging. They tell us that there's a connection, a dependence on some other idea to finish a thought. We have many fewer relative pronouns than subordinating conjunctions, but they're doing the same thing. They connect subordinate clauses to main clauses. And remember, dependent, subordinate, however you want to say it, these types of clauses do specific jobs in the sentence. The whole clause works like an adjective, an adverb, or a noun. These clauses depend on the main part of the sentence to convey the complete thought. Now it's our job to try to spot dependent word fragments. Ideally, we'd like to write sentences without any fragments on the first go-round, the first time we start writing, but that's not really how the writing process goes for most people, unless we happen to be like Albert Einstein and are total geniuses. What we generally do when we write, whatever kind of document it is, we generate ideas, we draft those ideas after we've come up in our minds with some kind of order for those ideas, and then we take that information that we've drafted and we revise it to make it better. Part of revising is cleaning up our writing so that there are no grammatical errors, and that's what we're looking at right now. How do we spot fragments of this type? Well, for any kind of fragment, we can simply look to see if we have a group of words that begins with a capital letter and ends in a piece of closing punctuation, and ask ourselves, is that complete? Does it leave us hanging? How do we know if something's leaving us hanging? Well, we can, if we're reading a piece of information that's been identified as a sentence, and when we finish reading it, we go, what? Or what? Then we know that that's probably a fragment. It's not a complete thought. We are a lot more likely to catch these fragments in our own writing, and any other writing for that matter, if we read a document from the end backwards, sentence by sentence. Why? Because then we're less likely to have our minds trick us in combining what sounds fine but has been broken up by capitalization and punctuation as separate sentences. We can also spot these fragments by looking for subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns that begin what have been identified as sentences, right? So in other words, we look at what is identified as a sentence and it begins with the word because. Well, there better be, besides the subject and verb that are right there with the word because, there should be an independent clause with a subject and a verb combined with that. Here are some examples. I've got an incorrect and a correct version of this situation. Because he made me cry, my husband brought me flowers. Well, that sounds fine to me. It sounds the same if I read the incorrect version and the correct version. However, we have a fragment in the incorrect version, because he made me cry. This word group has a subject, I'm pointing at it, has a verb, but it does not make a complete thought. Why? This word right here. The group of words in the incorrect version has been identified as a sentence, right? Capital letter, closing punctuation, but it does not make a complete thought, therefore it is a fragment. For this type of fragment, the best way to correct it is the way I've done below. I've removed the period, I've added a comma, and I've made the M in my a lowercase m. Here's another example of a fragment. The fragment in this instance is right here in bold. Until they won yesterday. Well, what? Okay, so if I read it all together, though, it sounds fine. I never thought the team would win until they won yesterday. All right, so we have to be very careful in looking for these guys. So what did I do to correct? I made the U and until lowercase, and I removed the comma. Excuse me, I removed the period. I did not add a comma. Most of the time when we add dependent clauses to the end of a sentence, a dependent clause to the end of the sentence, most of the time there will be no comma in front of it. We're going to talk about this in our comma rules later. One more dependent word fragment. Here we go. Although I always think that I am right, sometimes I might be wrong. The part in bold has been identified as a sentence. Although I always think that I am right. This word group begins with a dependent word. There's actually another one in there as well. These are two, dependent clauses stuck together. But we do not have a complete thought. What do we do to fix it? We get rid of the period, add a comma, and attach it to the following sentence, making the S and sometimes lowercase. Why do I have a comma here? Well, this has nothing to do in particular with this being a dependent clause and everything to do with a particular comma rule called introductory material. That could include single words, phrases, and full clauses like we have here, placed at the beginning of a sentence before the main part of the sentence. The next kind of fragment we're going to address is a little bit simpler and not quite as common as the first fragment type that we addressed, and this is the missing subject fragment. What does that mean? Well, I think this is pretty straightforward. In other words, when we have a group of words that have been identified as one sentence with a beginning capital and ending punctuation, in this particular instance there is no subject to be found in the sentence. But we got to think, why does this happen? Well, this situation happens most of the time when we have a group of words that begins with the conjunction and or the conjunction but. Please note though, having a sentence begin with and or but is not incorrect. There's no grammatical rule that says we can't do that. There are no grammar police who will come and get you if you start a sentence with and or but. However, those words might give us a clue. Just as with subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns, if we notice that a sentence does begin with and or but, it just might be a fragment. I love that Jeff Foxworthy line of thinking. We're not talking about rednecks here, and we're talking about sentence fragments, but the line of thinking still follows. It just might be a fragment if we see and or but. So when we see that, then we have to take the next logical step. Look for a subject. If there is a subject following and or but, then we should be fine, and the sentence is a sentence, a complete thought. But if there is no subject, then it's a fragment, not a sentence at all. Here are a couple of examples for you. The first one is, Will came downstairs and read me a story. Okay, we have a fragment right here, and read me a story. Please notice that when I read this, it sounded fine. It should have sounded fine to you, not choppy at all. But when we look at what I have identified as separate sentences, we see the problem. Here's a capital letter, starts off a sentence, closing punctuation, but there is no subject in that word group, so it's a fragment. We can correct this in two ways. First of all, we could add a subject, make this a compound sentence, comma, and Will came downstairs, comma, and he read me a story. Or we can make it even simpler. We don't have to add a comma, we don't have to add in a subject, and we can make this a simple sentence with a compound verb. Will came downstairs and read me a story. Sounds exactly the same orally as it did up here, but this one is punctuated and capitalized correctly. Here's another example. Neva is trying out for the soccer team but is unsure whether or not she will make it. I've given you two possible ways that this could be corrected. If you're worried that you're not going to do something right, if all else fails, make sure you add in that subject. We've done this by making this a compound sentence, comma, conjunction, adding a subject. But we could just leave it as a compound verb. Neva is trying out for the soccer team but is unsure whether or not she will make it. I've highlighted the verbs in green, and in this case Neva is serving this as the subject for both verbs. Up here Neva is the subject for is trying. The pronoun she is the subject for the verb is. Please note something. When we make these errors, these ideas tend to be ideas that are closely related. It makes sense to correct the error by making a compound sentence with two complete thoughts. This works fine as well, but you're probably coming up with two equally important ideas, and I think this is the best choice for correcting. Third kind of fragment is the phrase fragment. And in this kind of case, very much like the last kind of fragment that I'm going to describe for you, we have a situation where we're just wanting to emphasize something that we think is important, and thus we make a fragment error. The kinds of phrases that commonly are capitalized and punctuated as if they were sentences but don't make complete thoughts are ing and to fragments. I'm going to explain what those mean. When a word ends in ing, we know it's going to be some kind of verb form. That verb form doesn't mean that the word is necessarily going to act like a verb. We have an example here. She is singing well, where we have singing working as the verb along with the helping verb is. Often we might have an ing verb form, though, working like a noun. Singing is lots of fun. This right here is the subject of the sentence. We can even have ing verb forms that work like adjectives. Remember, adjectives are modifiers that modify nouns. Here we go. She is the singing nun. Singing is describing nun, and it's listed right in front of the word that it's describing. Often, just so you know, often when we have ing words that work as nouns or adjectives, there are other words clustered with it. Look at some of these examples. Singing in the shower. Singing very well. Singing with gusto. Those work as clusters to create a package of meaning. We actually have two types of phrases that begin with the word to. The most common one is the prepositional phrase. You looked at a whole bunch of prepositions already, words like in and around and under and above and after. Just a ton of words that are prepositions, which are locational words. But prepositions always work with nouns or noun substitutes to make a phrase, a group of words that do a job. Don't forget, prepositional phrases work like adjectives, they work like adverbs, and they work like nouns, but very rarely. Okay, so to is often, let me move this arrow, to is often used as a preposition, but to is also a part of something called an infinitive. Infinitives are a grouping of the word to and the dictionary form of a verb. Okay, the two things have to be together. When we have a phrase, an infinitive phrase, then we have other words, modifiers, and nouns that can be clustered with those words. Okay, just like to sing well, to sing tomorrow, to give a present, to work hard. All of those are infinitive phrases. Like prepositional phrases, infinitive phrases work like adjectives, adverbs, and nouns. Infinitive phrases work like nouns most of the time. Again, we've got to figure out how we can spot these little suckers. And it's always when we proofread, isn't it? So we follow the Jeff Foxworthy line of thinking. We go, that sentence might just be a fragment if it begins with a word ending in ing or begins with the word to. Once we spot those, then our job is to look for, in this case, both a subject and a verb. If it doesn't have it, then it's a fragment, not a sentence at all. Here are some phrase fragments. The incorrect version, my dears, sounds very correct if you're not listening carefully. Winning, the goal of all football players. That'd be great in an advertisement, but doesn't work as a sentence. Okay, what's missing? Well, it's missing a verb. The word is makes this a complete thought. Winning is the goal of all football players. Now, winning is a verb form, right? But it can't be a verb in the sentence if it doesn't have a helper in front of it. Here's another example. To manipulate parents, that is a teenager's goal. Again, this sounds like a soundbite. Sounds like something that would be on an ad on TV or in a magazine. The problem is we see that we have the T and to capitalized and a period. That indicates, that signals to us as readers that we have a complete thought, which we do not. So we have to fix it. Best way to fix this is to make that group of words that has been punctuated as a sentence a part of another sentence. And in this case, this works as a subject. To manipulate parents, this is an infinitive phrase, by the way, and it's working as a noun. And that particular noun is working as the subject of that sentence. We're down to our last type of fragment, and that is the added detail fragment. Very similar to phrase fragments. They're also phrases for the most part, but these occur when we're adding an extra detail and we want to emphasize that detail, and we mistakenly do so by capitalizing and punctuating that phrase or that word as if it were a sentence. Commonly, these types of fragments can begin with some of the words I have listed here. For example, especially, in fact, for instance, and particularly. These are some of the worst culprits of that start off added detail fragments. And again, we can use our understanding that these are the worst culprits to help us spot them. And what we can do is follow the Jeff Foxworthy line of thinking. That sentence just might be a fragment if it begins with, for example, for instance, particularly, and so on. And again, that's not enough, right? It just might be. So then we have to look to see, is there a subject? Is there a verb following those words? If so, then it would be a sentence. If not, it's not a sentence at all. It's a fragment. Here are some examples of added detail fragments. I love short, handsome men, especially my husband. Now, if I'm proofreading this, as we've talked about, I can tell right away that especially my husband doesn't make a complete thought, even though I've capitalized and punctuated this as if it were a sentence. Easy way to fix it, guys. All we have to do is attach especially my husband to the preceding sentence. In this case, we need to add a comma. Why? Because it's extra added detail. It doesn't have to be there for that sentence to make sense. It's an add-on. We need a comma to show so. Here's another one. I hate housework. For instance, washing dishes. If I just walked up to someone and said, for instance, washing dishes, that person might think I were pretty crazy, because that obviously isn't a complete thought. Again, to fix it, we attach. We attach, for instance, washing dishes to the sentence before. We add a comma, make that F lowercase, and we're done. Please note, if you use this for review, in the white box I've explained to you how I correct the error and what makes a fragment in these sentences. We're ready to sum it up now. Remember, if we have a group of words that's capitalized at the beginning and punctuated with closing punctuation marks, we're going to assume that it's a sentence, right? Fragments are incomplete thoughts that are mistakenly identified as sentences through that capitalization and punctuation. In every case, in all cases, fragments do not make complete thoughts. I don't care. If it doesn't make a complete thought, it's not a sentence. In most cases, fragments can be corrected by attaching them to other sentences or simply adding a single word. I sure hope this helps you.